Welcome back, everybody. This is your host, Jesse Weber of Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. As we sit here listening to the live feed in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, I want to bring on real quick my special guest, former FBI agent Bobby Chacon. Bobby, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
Bobby, real quick before we listen to the next witness in the Jeffrey Willis case, I was perplexed by the idea of trying to track a man like this who's been implicated in 3 different events. What do you make of it from your perspective?
Well, particularly in this case where there's no body, I mean, it's crucial to put him at the scene, I think. And I think that's what the last few witnesses were an attempt to do that, particularly the hairdresser and the co-worker that saw the van and may have seen him. So I think the prosecution is desperately trying to put him at the scene of the victim's disappearance.
And when you're covering these kind of cases and you're covering these kind of perpetrators, again, we should let our viewers and listeners know that Mr. Willis has already been convicted in the 2014 shooting death of Rebecca Bletch. He's now being implicated in the disappearance of Jessica Heringa, and it should also be noted that after this trial, he may face kidnapping charges in relation to trying to kidnap a teenager back in 2016. At what point does it make sense a man lives his entire life and then goes on a crime spree for the last several years? Can you explain that?
Well, I mean, our profilers would delve into his background, and they would likely see behavioral patterns that led up to it. In other words, you know, often we see cruelty to animals, or we see a fascination with fire. We see an escalation of behavior that ultimately ends in them starting to commit crimes against persons. Normally it's assaults that generally then tend to escalate and ultimately maybe rape and murder. So behavior is an escalating pattern. They don't always start out doing what they're ultimately convicted or arrested for doing. It's an escalation of behavior over a number of years that we look at that takes place.
It's interesting. You see it so much in movies, but it happens in real life, that escalating behavior. Bobby, stand by. We're going to go back live into the courtroom. Jeffrey Willis, again, is currently on trial for the murder of Jessica Heringa, who disappeared back in 2013. Let's go. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. For all of our listeners on Sirius XM, they are going over crime scene photos right now with the witness on the stand. You're listening and watching to the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, a man who's on trial for the murder of Jessica Heringa. But joining me via Skype right now is my very special guest, former FBI agent Bobby Chacon. So, Bobby, again, what's it like investigating these kinds of crimes?
What we're looking at right now is the physical part of the investigation, the crime. So that will match up with later witness testimony and other evidence that you might find. So this is the initial minutes of the police arriving there, and I think what we see on the screen now is a possible blood stain out back behind the door where the van was supposed to be. So this is a crucial piece of evidence. If this is in fact the victim's blood, it adds to the narrative of the story that she was taken out that back door and put into a van.
Right. That's the theory the prosecution's going with, that she was abducted from her gas station job in a silver van that was driven by Mr. Willis. And you heard earlier testimony from other witnesses, people that worked at the gas station, attesting to the fact that that's maybe what happened. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to go right back into the courtroom. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case here in Michigan, and this is a case about a man, a convicted murderer who's on trial for the abduction and murder of a woman named Jessica Heringa, who disappeared from her gas station job back in 2013. Now, her body has never been found, but despite that, the prosecution is moving forward with their case against him, and they're doing that by showing that there is evidence from other crimes he committed or may have committed that implicate him here. I want to bring on again former FBI agent Bobby Chacon. So this is an interesting case because, again, we keep talking about the fact that he's already been convicted in the shooting death of Rebecca Bletch, and he's being implicated in the potential kidnapping of a teenager back in 2016. What is, if you're profiling him and trying to understand him, Mr. Willis, what is the pattern here? Because that's what the prosecution's going for, a pattern. What do you see the pattern as?
Well, you look for significant, and this is the language the judge used in allowing some of the prior bad acts, is a significant similarity carrying out this crime as in these past crimes. So you look at the way he approached the victim, you look at the tools that he may have used to bond You look at his research.
Try to make a determination of where that battery
Yeah.
may have come
Bobby, I think we're losing your feed a little bit. It's okay. We'll stand by. We'll work on that. But we're going to go back live into the courtroom. Right now, there's an officer on the stand who is talking about the batteries that were found at the crime scene. And remember, those batteries match up with a gun that was found in Jeffrey Willis's van. There was a laser sight. And remember, the question is, did he steal that gun from his coworker? Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case here in Michigan, and this is a really interesting one to follow. It is a case about a man who is charged and implicated in the abduction and murder of a gas station clerk named Jessica Heringa, who disappeared back in 2013. Now, her body has never been found, but despite that, the prosecution is moving forward with their case, and it's really all about the evidence. So let's talk more about the evidence right now with former FBI agent Bobby Chacon. Bobby, I look at this case, there's a lot of evidence here. I mean, we just heard it from the officer who was on the stand, that a battery cover was found outside of the gas station where Jessica worked the night they believe that she disappeared, the night they believe she was abducted. And that battery cover matches the laser sight on the gun that was found in Jeffrey Willis's van. But for you, what is the most crucial piece of evidence in this case implicating Mr. Willis in the disappearance of Heringa?
Well, in this case, because we have no body and because the store didn't have any, video evidence of him coming and going, it really is not. There's not one particular damning piece of evidence. The prosecution's job here is more difficult because they have to piece all of these things together and build a preponderance of these things. So in the jury's mind, they can place Willis at the scene of the abduction. And that's crucial because we don't have video from the store. Normally, we always think these convenience stores have videos and these gas stations. But in this case, we don't have that. So the battery cover that fits the gun, if that spot of blood is actually tied to the clerk. Now, the defense's job is to dismiss a bunch of this away. We saw them go into whether the light was on or off. Later on, they will try to use that to say that the witness, the former coworker, didn't actually see him there. So we see what's going on. The prosecution is trying to put each piece to tie Willis. They have to put him at that scene because we have no body and because we have no video. They have to use a collection of items, forensic items in this case with this last officer, to put Willis at the scene. The van, the recollection of the coworker, the battery cover that matches his gun. All of these things have to add up to the jury's comfort level that Willis was at that scene. That's crucial for the prosecution's case.
And they're mapping out a time frame, right? So they believe that she disappeared around the 11 p.m. hour. There was one witness who testified that he saw Willis, or was with Willis playing, I think, Magic the Gathering, a card game, 2 hours, an hour and a half before the 11 p.m. hour. So he kept track from there. And then, but again, I think the silver van is huge here. So that same van that witnesses who saw it at the gas station is the same silver van, or seems to be the same silver van, that may have been used by Willis to potentially abduct that teenager back in 2016. So the van becomes a crucial piece of evidence as well. And not only the van, but what was found in the van, right?
Well, absolutely. And I think the fact the witness that you mentioned that may have been playing cards with him may have also mentioned the van, and that Willis had recently sold his sedan and obtained the van, which is going to be crucial later on because there could be evidence that comes in about these toolbox murders that he was researching on his computer. And that group of murderers actually did the same thing. They obtained a van just prior to them starting to carry out their crimes. And I think the judge may let that evidence in, and so this van does become crucial. It becomes Willis. The van is Willis, in effect. And so if they can put Willis's van at that store at the time of the abduction, then the prosecution has made great strides in advancing its case.
Well, if that van is Willis, it's a van filled with ball gags, rope, handcuffs. That's one way to identify one person. And, you look at the van and you look at the different pieces of evidence against him. It's interesting to follow. But at the same time, as we keep saying, the defense points out who actually saw him kill Jessica, who actually saw him take Jessica, who actually knew that they had a relationship. Did anyone ever see them talk? Because when you don't have a body and she wasn't found anywhere near him, that becomes a really big point for the defense.
You're seeing that in each of the cross-examinations. Each cross-examination relates to whether or not the victim actually, the witness actually saw Willis. You saw that with a coworker. He questioned the sketches. So I think later on, and he was successful in getting both sketches in, and you saw the prosecution do a short voir dire on whether or not, they objected to the first sketch because it really doesn't match Willis, even though the witness said later on that that sketch doesn't look anything like the guy I saw. The defense was successful in getting that sketch in front of the jury.
But now then the witness we saw right after that was his hairstylist, who said, you know what, I gave him some blonde highlights. So it raises questions for the jury. It's not an easy answer, yes or no. And I think, Bobby, we'll all agree, sometimes you're left with more questions than answers. But Bobby, I want you to stand by. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back from the break, we're going to go back into the Willis case. We have so much to talk about here. There's a lot of moving parts, and we'll break it down so you can easily understand it. We'll be back after this short commercial break. Stay tuned. Something wasn't right. That's the testimony of Susan Follett, a co-worker of the victim in the Jeffrey Willis case. Welcome back to Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. So Susan Follett testified earlier in this case, and remember, Jeffrey Willis is on trial for the abduction and murder of a gas station employee named Jessica Heringa. Susan Follett was saying that she drove by the gas station and saw this mysterious silver van, and no one appeared to be in the gas station. Something didn't feel right. I'm here with former FBI agent Bobby Chacon. Bobby, when you have these kind of witnesses and you're interviewing them, and they were put in a position right at the crime scene, the sense of guilt that she starts breaking down on the stand. We're going to play it a little bit more, but that sense of guilt when people are near a crime scene or right when something is happening, how do you communicate with them? What is their impressions of what was happening?
Well, the first thing you got to do is be sympathetic. However, I think in this witness, it's a little more problematic because I think that this witness's guilt is twofold. This witness's guilt, when she doubled back and she said something didn't seem right, we know that this coworker thought that Jessica was stealing product from the store. When they went back, I think when she says something wasn't right and she sees a van parked behind the store, she takes a position over in that strip mall to watch that van. It's my impression that she may, and this is only my conjecture, she may have thought that that van was there to help Jessica steal product. Because if it's an abduction of what we know now was happening, she would have called 911. When she followed that van away, they followed it for a while, and the van turned one way and they turned another way. Now she realizes that in that van was probably her coworker who was bound and gagged and about to be murdered. So that's an overwhelming sense of guilt. If in the beginning she thought that it was strange, something seemed out of place because it was an abduction, her and her husband may have gone straight to the store and inside to see if she was okay. They wouldn't have taken up a position in a nearby strip mall so they could see the van at the back door. My feeling is that, and I don't know if this came out in the testimony, my feeling is that she thought that van may have been there to help Jessica be stealing things. That's why they followed her away. That's why they didn't call 911 originally when they went back to the store. So, and now she realizes what actually was happening. So there may be a double layer of guilt there because of her, maybe what might have been her initial perceptions.
That's an interesting perspective. She mentioned on the stand that if Jessica was stealing product, it's not really my business. But what you make is a very good point, because we don't really know what's going on in her mind. We can have a sense, but that is a very interesting perspective, because, and that's what the defense is kind of doing, is showing that Jessica is not an innocent victim. At least that's what they're trying to do, that she had heroin abuse problems, she had a drug dealer, now they're saying she was stealing product. If you could try to paint a bad picture and say that she was involved with nefarious characters, how do you know that it was Mr. Willis, the one who was responsible for her disappearance? Let's play a little bit more of Susan Follett's testimony. Hopefully we'll have the live feed back in court, but if not, we'll have a lot more to discuss here in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Stay tuned. Again, this is the testimony of Susan Follett from earlier. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, a convicted murderer who is on trial for the abduction and murder of a woman named Jessica Heringa, who disappeared back in 2013. Joining me real quick before I go to my break, I have former FBI agent Bobby Chacon. Bobby, you're listening to the testimony right now, and again, what is the importance of the battery cover here? So we're talking about a gun. We know that Jeffrey Willis had a gun found in his van. Now we're trying to understand that there's a battery cover here. Can you tie it up for us right now?
hoping that the battery cover found at the scene matches the gun found in Willis's van, thereby putting Willis at the scene of the abduction. It's as simple as that. They need as much of that type of information, that circumstantial type of evidence, to match so that the jury can feel comfortable that, in fact, Willis was at the site of the abduction.
And let's not forget the man who's on the stand right now sold that gun to Willis's co-worker. Willis's co-worker testified yesterday, and she said that someone stole her gun from her house. And where was the gun found? In Jeffrey Willis's van. We'll take a quick break. We'll jump right back into the Jeffrey Willis case. Welcome back, everybody. I'm your host, Jesse Weber, here on the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. Thank you for joining us. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, a man who is on trial for the abduction and murder of a gas station clerk named Jessica Herringa, who disappeared back in 2013. We're going to go back live into the courtroom. Right now is a man named Gary Foster. He's a gun store owner. He sold a gun to Willis's co-worker. That gun went missing from her home, and it was found in Jeffrey Willis's van. The battery cover to the laser sight on that gun was found at the Jessica Herringa crime scene. You can pretty much see how everything is connected. Let's go live into the courtroom. All right, welcome back, everybody. This is Jesse Weber, your host here on Law&Crime. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case, a convicted murderer who's on trial for the murder of Jessica Herringa. Joining me again is former FBI agent Bobby Chacon. Bobby, one of the interesting aspects of this Jeffrey Willis saga, because we've seen him in and out of the news and in and out of courtrooms, is a man named Kevin Blum. His cousin, who in the Rebecca Bletch murder case, remember Jeffrey Willis, has already been convicted in her murder. He said that he was an accessory after the fact, that he helped Willis bury the body of Jessica Herringa. But her body has never been found. How do you think Kevin Blum's going to factor into this trial?
You know, that's going to be interesting. I think for the prosecution, somebody like Kevin Blum, he cuts both ways, because not only did he tell them where, I believe he took the police to the location where he says that a pre-dug grave had already been when he went there with Willis to get rid of the body. He took them there where he says it was. No body was found. They used cadaver dogs, no sign of a body having been there. There's a lot of different ways that can cut. It could be that he forgot and brought them to the wrong place. It could mean he had a change of heart, and when he went out that day with them, he didn't want to take them to the body. It could mean that he's fabricating the whole thing. He's a very problematic witness. He adds a lot of important things for the prosecution, but also he's got a lot of things that the defense can use to kind of muddy the waters of the whole story.
And so he could plead the fifth. He could plead the fifth and is right against self-incrimination. So even if they try to get him to testify, he could plead the fifth. Let's go back live into the Jeffrey Willis case. A new witness is on the stand. Again, Jeffrey Willis is on trial for the murder of Jessica Herringa, who disappeared in 2013. And as we said, her body has never been found. New witness on the stand. Before we go, we don't have audio yet in the courtroom, so we'll go back to it. But Bobby, again, I have Bobby Chacon here, former FBI agent. Yeah, we keep talking about Kevin Blum because really the fact that her body has never been found is an eerie component of this case, right?
That's right. So if the prosecution can establish that he's a credible witness, he puts the body in Willis's possession in the basement of the grandfather's house. So I think that he's crucial to that point of the prosecution's case. However, again, the prosecution knows that he has some credibility issues about his testimony.
I would say so. He said he knew where the body was, and there was no body.
Right.
We'll have to see, Bobby. Stand by. Let's go back live into the courtroom. All right, folks, on the stand right now is David Hayhurst, a DNA expert testifying in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Remember, Jeffrey Willis is on trial for the murder of Jessica Herringa. Now, as this expert goes into what DNA is and the background information, we're gonna spare you all those details. But when he gets into the nitty-gritty about what DNA was found and where, we'll make sure to go back into the courtroom. What I want to do right now, and Bobby Chacon and I are going to talk about a little bit more, is the testimony from Susan Follett, who testified earlier. She was a co-worker of Jessica Herringa, and she was allegedly right there when she disappeared. She testified that a silver van pulled up to Jessica's workplace. She saw a man exit the van, go back into the driver's seat and pull away, and it was a van that went to the side of the building, and it looked by all accounts to be a kidnapping, that when Jessica was kidnapped. So let's go to some of her testimony from earlier. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case here out of Michigan, a man who is on trial for allegedly abducting and murdering a woman named Jessica Herringa, who disappeared back in 2013. And despite the fact that her body has never been found, the prosecution is pushing forward with their case against Mr. Willis. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll have a lot more to talk about here in a pivotal case from the Midwest. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case here. We're live in the courtroom. Right now, a DNA expert is on the stand, just going over the specifics about what DNA is. But as soon as it gets to the particulars of this case, we'll make sure to go into it. For anybody joining us, this is, again, the case of Jeffrey Willis, a man, I should say, a convicted murderer who is on trial for the abduction and murder of a woman named Jessica Herringa that disappeared in 2013. Now, this is an interesting case from a number of levels, and specifically because despite the fact that her body has never been found, the prosecution is moving forward. One of the ways they're doing that is by taking evidence from other crimes that Mr. Willis committed or may have committed and using it in this case. Specifically, the fact that Mr. Willis was convicted in the shooting of Rebecca Blech back in 2014. Also, he's been implicated in the abduction, or the potential abduction, I should say, of a teenager back in 2016. So evidence from both of those events are being used here. I want to bring in real quick former FBI agent Bobby Chacon. Bobby, I talked about it a little bit, how evidence from the kidnapping and evidence from the Rebecca Blech murder is taking center stage in this case. We saw that particularly in the first few days of the trial. What did you make of it so far about the evidence that's being presented by the prosecution?
Well, normally, as we know, normally bad acts of the defendant in prior crimes are not admissible. And I think we had a lot of pretrial motion practice on this case, and the prosecution won some important victories to include some of his prior bad acts, his prior crimes, in this particular case. Because normally, look, a defendant is really only responsible for defending himself for this particular crime, and the government has to prove this particular crime beyond any reasonable doubt, right? So prior bad acts are usually seen as somewhat irrelevant. However, in pretrial motions, the hearings, the judge ruled that some of these previous acts are so significantly similar to the way this act was carried out or is alleged to have been carried out, that evidence could be admissible to this jury to show that this defendant, now that he's been convicted in the past of the murder of the jogger, that's fact. That conviction is a fact that the jury can now consider in this case as Willis, as a fact that Willis did commit that murder. So you know, there has to be some significant similarities in the type of abduction and the victim, and you know, so the judge has already ruled that. That was an important victory for the prosecution. The defense was successful in keeping some of the things out from the search warrant of his computer and things, but some of that stuff is also coming in. And so I think that's going to have a significant impact on allowing the jury to look at Willis as, you know, a prior convicted murderer. And so it gets over a certain burden that the prosecution usually has to reach, that this is a bad actor. The defendant is a bad person. And so the prosecution won important victories pre-trial that now that evidence is coming in to this jury.
I mean, we're talking about a pattern here, right? So we have three women. We're talking about three different women. We're talking about the use of a van in connection with three of those cases. We're talking about a gun being used in three. We're talking about abduction in three. We're talking about potential torture, rape of all three. I mean, this really is a case where they're trying to establish a pattern of similarities. Now, not all three cases ended the same way. You have the disappearance of one, the murder of another, and the potential of abduction of a third. But you can try to see how it was all going in the same way, using the same method. Three different results, but the same method. Now, you mentioned a good point about the fact that some of the evidence is not being let in. Just to let our viewers and our listeners know, but not the jury, one of the things that's not being let in is videos that were found on Willis's computer showing torture and necrophilia. Now, according to the defense, according to the court, that is just way too prejudicial for this jury. But is that true? What do you think, Bobby?
Well, in law school, they taught us that the value of the probity value of the evidence to the jury has to outweigh the prejudicial value. And in this case, the judge decided that these videos are so horrific they would prejudice the jury, that anybody that had these on their computer and anybody that watched these on their computer probably could carry them out in real life. So that's, what value does the jury have in probing
right,
that? Now,
because there's no evidence that she was raped. There was no evidence that she was tortured.
That's right. And the judge said that. He cited that there's no allegations that the things that happen, like necrophilia, in those videos actually happened in these cases, so that the prejudicial value outweighs any probity that the jury would put into these videos.
Yeah, well said, Bobby. That's exactly right. Here's what we're going to do as we wait for the live feed back in the courtroom. Again, we do have it, but you just have a DNA expert going on about DNA. I'm not sure that's the most interesting thing right now, but I do have something very interesting for you. We have been playing you the testimony of Jessica Heringa's co-worker. Her name was Susan Follett. She is a person that worked at the same gas station. She wasn't working on the night that Jessica disappeared, but she did drive by. And what she saw disturbed her. She saw a silver van outside of there, and what she also saw was a man that may or may not have been Willis going into that van and driving away. It is believed by the prosecution that he had Jessica at that moment and drove away with her. Let's play you some more testimony from earlier. Welcome back to Law and Crime. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're cutting out of that testimony from earlier because we're going to go live now into the Jeffrey Willis case. The DNA expert right now on the stand is talking about the DNA found on the battery cover at the crime scene. Remember, Jessica Heringa was allegedly kidnapped by Jeffrey Willis at the ExxonMobil gas station. So let's listen in about what he found. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case. There is a live feed. We've been covering it. You've just been listening to the DNA expert who's on the stand right now. Again, Mr. Willis is on trial for the abduction and murder of a woman named Jessica Heringa, who disappeared back in 2013. As we listen to the DNA evidence about what was found and whose DNA was on what, I want to again bring in former FBI agent Bobby Chacon. We keep talking about evidence, Bobby, and the evidence that was found in Willis's van, this potential rape kit that had all of this stuff on it, insulin on it. The one thing we got to talk about is this toolbox killers, this list of different serial killers. What did you make of Mr. Willis having that? Because he tried to explain it away in the Rebecca Bletch case.
Yeah, well, that's another thing that was subject to a pretrial hearing in this case, in that the judge ruled that the way the toolbox killers videos and the way they carried out their crimes was so significantly similar to this crime that he's going to allow any evidence related to things that Willis had on his computer that related to the toolbox murders. He's going to allow that evidence into this trial because it's so similar. So the prosecution can clearly put forth that, he was either mimicking or copycatting these toolbox killers because, in fact, he had a toolbox and he had an abduction kit, if you will, similar to the ones that were on the videos that were on his computer. So maybe this was a learning lesson for him. Maybe he was, mimicking them or copycatting them. So I think that's a very, very important piece of evidence that, the judge has ruled that he's going to allow the prosecution in. He said in other videos that aren't as tied significantly to the way this crime was carried out are not going to be admissible, but the toolbox murders, specifically the judge mentioned in one of his pretrial rulings, all going to be allowed in this trial.
Bobby, two things. One, it was interesting because in the Rebecca Bletch murder, Jeffrey Willis testified in his own defense. He went on the stand and said, look, I was trying to help the police. Trying to help the police look a little bit about who might have done this, and I'm keeping a folder of the victims. You remember he had a folder that was titled VIX, short for victims, and both Jessica Heringa's name was in there, as well as Rebecca Bletch, the person that he was convicted of killing. So he's just helping the police. Then you mentioned the videos that were found that are not being introduced in this case. We talked a little bit about it earlier, but there were also videos on Willis's computer showing roadside abductions, assaults, and murders of women, but the judge said not going to allow that in. It's too graphic and not relevant to this case. But I find that interesting in the sense that how is it not relevant to this case if you're going to introduce evidence about his shooting of Rebecca Bletch and his potential abduction of a teenager? So why let that evidence in but not the evidence of having these videos?
Well, I think, again, it goes to, the judge balances the probity versus the prejudicial effect on the jury. And the judge walks a fine line in these cases, knowing that, these issues could be appellate issues moving forward. So the judge has to, err on the side of caution in allowing some of this evidence in. And, you know, he did say that with respect to the toolbox murders, if it's related to that, that's specific enough. But a general roadside abduction may not be specific enough. So you can see how he's kind of walking that fine line and kind of trying to bring some legal wisdom into, you know, into a balancing act of what the jury can see and what, you know, may be too prejudicial to the jury.
Yeah, it's an interesting balancing test nonetheless. Let's go live now into the courtroom. Again, the DNA expert is on the stand in the Jeffrey Willis case, a man who's on trial for the murder of Jessica Heringa, who disappeared in 2013, and her body has never been found. Let's go live. Welcome back, everybody. You're watching and listening to Law and Crime. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case, a man who's on trial for the murder of Jessica Heringa, who disappeared back in 2013. Before I sign off with Bobby Chacon, an attorney and former FBI agent, got to ask you the million-dollar question. Will Jeffrey Willis, the defendant, take the stand in this case?
You know, that's obviously going to be a crucial question. I think probably his defense attorney will wait and weigh the prosecution's case in chief as it comes in and make that decision when they absolutely have to at the end of the prosecution's case, and maybe even into their own defense case, and see how successful they are in getting some of their evidence in on the defense case. So I think that, you know, I don't think that they've made that decision yet. I don't think normally a defense attorney will make that decision until they see how the prosecution's case in chief comes in, and then maybe some of the success or failures they have in getting
Bobby,
their own in.
I know we have to see. Bobby, thank you so much for joining us. We have to go to a quick break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.